Hi, I'm Netta, an application engineer at MTC Solutions, and today I'm going to talk about the Megant pre-engineered beam hanger. They come into three different series: the 60 series, the 100 series, and the 150 series, which is the one that I have right here. In this video, I'll explain the different components of the Megant and talk about what you'll see during its installation. In the later half of the video, we'll show a complete installation instructions for the Megant 310 by 150. What I have in front of me is a sample Megant that I'll be using to show different components throughout the video. But in reality, you'll be installing much bigger connectors. So this one is a plate from the Megant 310 by 150, and I'll also be using this as an example. The first identical component that the Megant has are the connector plates. One connector plate is installed into the girder member or a column, and that's what we call a primary member. And the other one is installed into a purlin, and that's what we call a secondary member. You may see different terminologies used in our beam hanger design guide or in your work plan. For a typical installation where you're bringing your beam from the top, the secondary member is the one where you're installing your connector into the end grain. If you take a closer look at the connector plates themselves, you'll see that they have different markings. So they will either have an A or a B. And this is the direction that the screws will be placed in depending on the marking. So if you're installing your screws with the A pointing upwards, the screws will be pointing upwards. Now, if you're installing your connector with the B pointing upwards, your screws will be pointing downwards. This direction is really important. This is where the connection actually gets its capacities from. So always double check that you have the correct positioning of the plates. All of the Megant beam hangers use ASSI VGCSK 8x160 self-tapping screws for the installation. You may need pre-drilling prior to the installation, but typically for these self-tapping screws, you can install them without pre-drilling. The next component that you'll be installing are the clamping jaws. The clamping jaws are identical, however, one of them has a smooth section and the other one has a threaded portion in there. If you have a typical installation, let's say you're dropping your beams from the top, make sure that the threaded clamping jaw is placed at the bottom. And I will show you in an example. Let's say you have installed all your components here. You have your connector on the other side. For demonstration purposes, I don't have that. But if you have your smooth clamping jaw at the top and your threaded clamping jaw at the bottom, you would simply place in your rod and then tighten it. If you do the same exact thing but backwards, now you have the threaded clamping jaw at the top, the installation now becomes impossible. This will also depend on the installation configuration that's spec'd in your work plan. Please double check and make sure you're installing the jaws into the correct position. After you're done installing your connector plate and your clamping jaw in the correct position, now it's time to drop everything into place and tighten it using the threaded rod. The threaded rod has a 8mm Allen key machined at the top and is used for installing the rod itself. So here I have a sample that shows a cross section of a typical installation if you're bringing your beam from the top. So you have your threaded clamping jaw at the bottom here. Once you're ready, you can simply drop your threaded rod into place and tighten it using the Allen key at the top. This really depends on the configuration of your installation. This is what I've mentioned here is just a typical installation, but check your work plan and make sure that this position is correct. Typically, you want to have your Allen key in the opposite direction of your threaded rod. What I want to mention about the 150 series is that if you take a look at the plates, so this is the Megant 310 by 150 series, you'll see three different slots that you can place the rods in. However, this particular model only comes with one rod. The threaded rod for this model should only be installed into the middle. If you have bigger Megants, such as the 430 by 150, they'll come with two rod, but still three slots. You have to make sure that you're only installing the outermost slots. check your work plan and make sure that you have the correct number of rod and you're placing them into the correct slots. Once you've installed your threaded rod and it's tightened, it's time to complete your installation by placing your washer and your nut. It's very simple. You would place your washer, then you would tighten your nut using a socket wrench and making sure that you're inserting the correct torque amount. You can check that either into your work plan or our beam hanger design guide. You can also use a torque wrench to check the amount of torque that you're applying. With this, your installation is now complete. Now for some checklist items. Make sure when you're installing the connector plates, the A and the B markings are placed in the correct spot as per your work plan. This will determine the direction of the incline screws. When you're installing the clamping jaws, make sure the smooth and the threaded clamping jaw are installed in the correct position. For a typical drop-in installation from the top, the threaded portion is at the bottom. When you're placing your threaded rod, make sure the Allen key is pointing in the opposite direction of your threaded clamping jaw for a smooth installation. Again, this depends on the configuration that's spelled out in your work plan. If you find that you misinstalled the connector, don't panic. Don't remove any parts. Talk to your supervisor and they'll get in touch with our technical support team and we'll come up with a good work plan on relocating the Megant to its proper location. This concludes the explanation portion of the video. In this next section, we'll go through a detailed installation of the Megant 310 by 150.
Okay, so we'll do the housing. The housing should be accordingly sized to fit the size of the Megant, plus the clamping jaw at the bottom that has to slide into the connector. So that's important to oversize this portion. The housing should be 151 millimeters wide to give us 1 millimeter tolerance to the left and right of the connector to allow for possibly slightly twisted beam or manufacturing tolerances. The connector plate is marked with the letter A and the letter B on the opposite side. It is important to note that on one side of the connection, the letter A needs to be facing upward. On the other side of the connection, the letter B will be facing upward. This helps you to identify the right direction of the screws so that they are in the tension application. Once we install the connector, we already have the locator hole pre-drilled with our CNC machine that secures the right height of the connector in our assembly. We are using regular fully threaded wood screws, 5/16 by 6 1/4 inch, to fasten the connector into our timber element. We are using regular cordless drill, 18-volt drill with 6-inch extension and a regular AW bit that is suitable for the fasteners that we are using for the installation. For the actual screw installation, again, we refer back to the pilot hole. It's important to note now that letter A is facing upwards. We find the pilot hole that we have started drilling already, and we are installing one wood screw into the connector. For tightening, we want to make sure the connector is sitting the right height, so we have a little bit of room for bigger. Make sure the hole is centered, and we tighten the wood screw. Before we install one of the second screws up here, we make sure the connector is perfectly aligned with the outside wall or parallel to the outside wall of the housing. For screw installation, we use the pre-drill jig that is suitable to fit into all holes, 90-degree holes and 45-degree holes, to help us pre-drill the holes. For the installation, we need to make sure that we are installing 90-degree screws first, simply because if we were to install 45-degree screws first, they would always pull the connector out of position, so that we have tolerance issues later. So important is to install 90-degree screws first, which we want to pre-drill with the regular 4mm drill bit. We're placing jig. We are pre-drilling the hole slightly. We drill another hole down here. We would pre-drill 45-degree holes at the bottom location first, because this is where the clamping jaw will sit. So we want to make sure those ones are drilled first. Once we have pre-drilled the holes, we start installation of fastener. Now we need to fill every single hole with wood screws until all holes are filled. Once the connector plate is installed, we can again control our heights and make sure the measurements that we need are all accurate. And the connector is mounted level plugged into our housing. The next step we need to do is to install the clamping jaws. There is one clamping jaw with threads in it. The other clamping jaw does not have any threads in it. So in this installation case, which is the most common case, the clamping jaw with the threads will go at the bottom. It's important that we note to have the holes with the countersunk in them facing forward. Again, we install the clamping jaw into the housing. We push the clamping jaw into the position. Then we use the same fasteners that we have used before. We use the 5/16 by 6¼ fastener and install the clamping jaw where it is. We again fill all the holes of the clamping jaw with the respective fasteners. The next step for completion is now to install the threaded rod. Note there is, depending on connector size, either 1 rod, 2 rods, or 3 rods, depending on capacity. All rods have an 8mm hex socket in the top that helps you to install the threaded rod with a regular socket wrench that fits into the threaded rod. That allows you, for deeper installation of beams, to install the rod from the top and ratchet the entire assembly into the system until it is completed and done. Typically, we want to make sure that this is all driven in so that it is flush at the bottom. And it's important to install the bottom screws, the bottom implant screws, prior to installing the clamping jaw, simply because once the clamping jaw is installed, you have no more access into the inclined holes, but you would be able to install fasteners into all other holes of the connector. Another important element to note is that, as you can see here, the connector is not 100% recessed into the column member. It is actually sitting 1mm proud, and that 1mm compensation here will occur in the end grain of the secondary or main member. We'll show that in the next steps. So for now, this assembly here is completed and we can put this to the side. If you have any questions or concerns on fire ratings or fire resistances in cavities, we would advise to fill this cavity with regular non-combustible rock wool material so that the connection is protected from below and no cavity or void can form connection internal char.
Here we have the end grain of the secondary member if we were to connect into a main member, or the beam side of a post and beam connection. In the previous steps, we explained how to install the Megant connector into a column. Here we now look at the installation of a Megant connector on the end grain or the beam face. You can see we have cut a recess or routed out a recess which deals with the access tolerance from the column member, and we have a 1 millimeter shim that we can use to approximately check whether we have that 1 millimeter recess that we require to completely house the connection gap-free around the entire assembly, so that no heat or fire can get onto the metal part, which would essentially heat up and reduce connection capacity during a fire. What we need to look at now is again the same element. I have marked this up with an arrow and have also marked this up with an arrow that indicates the top of the beam, because the beam layup is different at the bottom than it is at the top for strength reasons. And in this particular case, we now need to have the side with the letter B facing upwards, so that the fasteners that are driven in are again in a tension scenario. Now keep in mind that the clamping jaw is now required to be at the top and needs to sit at the top. To accommodate that in a later step, we have again highlighted a locator hole that reflects the location of that screw to the bottom left. To install the connector now, we again need to go back to our regular 5/16 by 6 1/4 fastener, the regular bit extension, cordless tool, and the installation process that we already know. So we are looking to find that locator hole, screw is placed there and installed. Next step is to pre-drill the holes with the regular 4 millimeter drill bit. So the pre-drill jig again fits into the 90-degree holes, which we need to pre-drill and install first, so that the tension screws do not pull the connector plate downwards out of position. Important is, again, we installed one locator screw now. We want to make sure the connector is sitting parallel to the edge of the glue-lamp member, so we can make sure that the edge is, well, there's the same distance of the connector plate to the edge of the housing. Once we have checked that, we pre-drill. And again, remember, we need to install those screws first, because the clamping jaw will come from the top into position to finally assemble the connector. So we are pre-drilling the holes at the top. And we would do so for all other holes in the connector assembly. Once the holes are pre-drilled, we again use same machine, same fasteners to fasten the connector plate to the beam end. Now we would proceed and install one fastener into each hole until all holes are filled. Next step we want to do is to install the clamping jaw. Again, the clamping jaw facing forward with the milled out holes. See, the clamping jaw fits nicely snug into the housing. There's no gap at the top, so everything is tight fit and where it belongs. Again, you may choose to pre-drill those holes with the pre-drill jig, because those holes are relatively easy to pre-drill without the pre-drill jig too. You do not necessarily have to reinstall the remaining fasteners into those holes. Make sure the holes are clean so that the screw head is bearing nicely on the countersunk hole. And we would make sure we install fasteners into every single hole of the jaw. Next step now is to combine both elements and show you how the install of the connector with the crane would essentially work. The remaining elements then are to install the washer, the nut, and ratchet the nut tight with a regular 30 millimeter socket. Need to make sure your faces are flush and parallel to each other. Once that is secured, we can go ahead and lower the beam. Okay, lower the beam. Everything slides together. The final step to do is to install the washer and the nut. So we're going ahead, installing the washer first. That has to be dropped down. The nut is the next element that we are installing. We can hand tighten the nut. Once the nut is hand tightened, we can use a regular 30mm wrench to tighten the connection together until top flush on our beam side. We are top flush on the beam side. Okay, good.